Africa has accused Israel of violating the Genocide Convention and filed a case at the UN court, primarily with regards to the treatment of Palestinians in the occupied territories. It asserts that Israel's policies and actions in these areas amount to acts of genocide, arguing that Israel's occupation and colonization of Palestinian territories, particularly the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza Strip, constitutes an illegal act under international law, alleging also that Israel's policies systematically force Palestinians out of their homes, aiming to displace and dispossess the Palestinian population. It also says that Israel's siege and blockade of the Gaza Strip constitutes collective punishment, which is illegal under international humanitarian law. So we're discussing today. To date, 57 nations have supported South Africa's claim, including Bangladesh. And we're discussing this very complicated issue here on DC to Dhaka. I'm Nicolette de Vidar, and with us today are Akshaya Kumar. She's the Director of Crisis Advocacy at Human Rights Watch here in New York. Dr. Amina Mohsin, a professor of international relations at the University of Dhaka, a graduate also from Cambridge in the UK and University of Hawaii. Thanks so much for joining in.
Thank you.
Very complicated issues, ladies. Let's dive right in and unpack some of this, because I feel that with all the complications, it's first of all very difficult to understand, and it's hard to kind of value what's actually more important or less important to the extent we can. So let's unpack it. South Africa historically stood with Palestine. So Nelson Mandela said, "Our freedom is not complete without the freedom of Palestinians." So on what exact grounds, Amina, did actually Bangladesh join this accusation?
Well, thank you very much for that question. I think it's, if you look at the history of Bangladesh, this is a nation which was also born out of a genocide. And Bangladesh still is fighting for it, for the recognition of the genocide which was committed by the Pakistani military and its collaborators in 1971. So, Bangladesh, the people of Bangladesh also, historically, they have supported all the causes for liberation, for self-determination. So that aside, Bangladesh's own history is reflective of this. And if you look at how Bangladesh has hosted the Rohingya refugees, we are hosting, more than 1 million Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh. And we are also fighting this case, which was taken up in the ICC and ICJ by Gambia and Bangladesh's position is that the state of Myanmar has committed genocide on the Rohingya population, and we are hosting them. In fact, I, along with many of my colleagues, we are working on this issue at this moment. And the case of Palestine, which is, this is a case where this is, one can clearly say that this is a clear case of genocide. And if you go by the legal definition of genocide also, one can see that what is happening in Palestine and in the Gaza Strip, it's a clear case of genocide where you are killing children, attacks are being made on the civilians, unarmed population, the elderly. I'm not going to list the atrocities committed by the state of Israel for the sake of time management, but Bangladesh has historically stood by the oppressed.
Yeah. Akshaya, what is Human Rights Watch or perspective on this issue?
Human Rights Watch has been tracking the proceedings quite closely. And in fact, we have engaged not just with the South African case against Israel, but also with the Gambia's case against Myanmar, the case that the professor just referred to. And in both of these situations, we see that it's incredibly important for interstate disputes and claims to be brought and settled in front of judges. These are situations that deserve the world's attention, and we cannot wait for history to judge and decide what happened here. That's why we have the international justice system to weigh in and make its determinations. And these are both cases we will will be watching quite closely. I do think that one thing I've been struck by has been the real difference in approach and attitude, particularly from Western governments. Just at the end of last year, you had a group of Western governments, including the United Kingdom, Canada, France, and Germany, as well as the Netherlands, intervene in the case against Myanmar with some points of law, emphasizing the importance of preventing genocide and spotlighting issues related to women and children. And now those same countries are taking a much more skeptical stance towards the South African claim. And this two-handed approach is something that's become quite obvious to us who are observing the situation.
In fact, actually, Namibia also scathed Germany for actually intervening on the Israel case, with also particular history that Germany and Namibia with the Herero background or past that has never been acknowledged, but the Holocaust has been acknowledged. This is a very iffy issue, which brings up the next question, which I actually had planned for later, but I do want to ask because it's really something that we need to talk about at this point. And it seems that the global South still perceives it as old colonial thinking, in many ways having sort of an advantage or a privilege, get priority, so to speak, versus other claims. Where are you both coming in on this perspective? Does it come across like this? Is the global South seeing this clearly as such? Or is, in case of Israel, just so much baggage in there from history, from the past, and because of how shocked the world was, that it would be more justified in this case? I'm going to call on Amina first, since Akshaya spoke before, and then we switch.
I want to make one thing clear, that when we talk about the global South is a differentiated global South. We do not have a homogeneous global South, because if you look at the position of India, that is clearly not in sync with the position that Bangladesh has taken, and other countries from many other countries from the global South have taken. So I guess on this, it is, of course, when we look at what the global North is doing, it is, of course, the colonial baggage is there. I mean, and the double standards are very clear to us. I mean, when the global North talks about human rights issues, they talk about, they take positions. I guess that the geopolitics comes in very strongly. It's not only geopolitics; it's also geoeconomics. It's also the military business industrial complex that comes in very strongly. So it is basically essentially real politics which is at play over here. In the case of Myanmar, the Western countries have taken a particular position, but again, you can see that geopolitics is playing a major role over there. China is a critical factor over there, where Myanmar is concerned. And we can also see the Indo-Pacific, the American and Indian position on the Indo-Pacific, as well as the BRI. But over here, it's a different kind of politics. So I think it's essentially real politics that is at play over here, and the interests of the military industrial complex that is also very much over there. But it really, I mean, when you have these double standards and different layers and differentiated approaches, I mean, what is at stake is that where does, what values are you privileging? What ideals or principles are you privileging or upholding? Is it democracy, human rights issues, or is it pragmatism and just crude real politics? That is something one has to really ponder and reflect on and take it very seriously.
Akshaya, your take?
Well, I think that one of the things that's quite apparent is in multilateral fora, we are going to see an increasing dynamic where countries that are in favor of this petition from South Africa are going to point out that their approach is principled and one aligned with being party to the Genocide Convention and seeing the value of having an international court allow for proceedings for interstate dispute settlement. And we now have, by some counts, almost 125 states, if you include the non-aligned movement, the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, the League of Arab States, as well as countries like Brazil and Colombia from Latin America, all speaking out in favor of this South African approach. So you do have a huge number of countries, largely from the global south, who have been quite supportive. And from the global north, we've seen a very different approach, perhaps with the exception of Belgium, who have taken the unique approach of saying that they do see some value in this. And I think we're going to see that dynamic play out over and over again, whether it be at the G20 or the United Nations General Assembly, particularly if the court does what we think it will, which is in the next week or 2 weeks, make a decision on provisional measures. Because then you will have a question of enforcement. And I think that's where the issues of realpolitik that Professor Amina was referencing will really come into play.
Do you think this is a cultural issue, or is this more a leftover from the colonial aspect? When you look at the how the countries actually approached it, when you look at the countries, the US, the UK, the European Union, Australia, taking a stand against it, and then you look at all the other countries, where you have many firsts, like Bolivia called it a historic move. You have really countries that haven't spoken out on that issue yet. So I wonder, how much do you think is actually a cultural thing, and how much is sort of really a geopolitical thing, which I think we all agree on, that's definitely at play, and how much it is a leftover colonial thinking?
That kind of analysis is not my expertise, but what I can say is there's a fourth possibility here, and one that we shouldn't ignore, which is the importance of rule of law, and the importance of these small states seeing the international system where rule of law continues to have some respect and meaning, being something important and worth preserving. So if you look at a place like the United Nations General Assembly, every country has one vote. And it was in that General Assembly that 2 resolutions have been able to be adopted about the situation in Gaza with relation to the humanitarian need, for example. Meanwhile, the Security Council has been paralyzed with deadlock in the hands of the permanent 5 members, and particularly the US, which has exercised its veto to protect its ally, Israel. And so I think there's also something to be said for countries, particularly smaller countries, countries from the developing South, who see that this international system is a forum not just for Western countries to bring up human rights issues against them, but for the opposite, for that same equity of arms to take place. And what's really powerful in the case of Gambia, for example, against Myanmar, is you have a global South country from a different continent bringing to the international arena, to The Hague, the junta in Myanmar to raise claims on behalf of the afflicted Rohingya population who are stateless, who have been made stateless by the Myanmar authorities. And in the case of South Africa, a very similar dynamic. Here you have a global South champion with the legacy of Nelson Mandela going to The Hague to make these claims on behalf of another population which doesn't have status to do so itself.
Amina, your response to that, or your response to my question?
No, I think it's both. When I'm responding to your question very directly. On the one hand, like when you say like I think I would try to unpack the state and the society. If you look at the people of the United States, if you look at the people in Canada or in people in many Western countries, they are supporting the cause of Palestine. But the state is not. So I would want to unpack it and see, look at it in a differentiated way. So when you say culture, I think there is something in the culture, in the status culture, on in the status mind, where it does not allow the state structure maybe to decolonize. So I wouldn't say that it's the culture it's of those countries, because you can see like reactions to what is happening there in Palestine in very differentiated way. As I said, that people are protesting. I mean, even when the United States had supported Pakistan in 1971, we saw the concert for Bangladesh taking place right there in the Madison Square. So these things are happening. So it's a very multi-layered world and a very complex situation. So
Hmm.
I would say that there is a very jingoistic culture. I mean, I wouldn't want to label the Western world like that at all. But what again, I will go back to the same thing, to my old position, that yes, the colonial mindset is there, maybe in the mindset of the uh, ruling elite. Maybe there is that kind of like if you, even if you look at the United Nations today, the makeup of the Security Council, it is so colonial. I mean, most of the, I mean, it is something where a group, I mean, if you look at the population of the world, total population of the world, only a few countries with so much less population are determining what the fate of the world is going to be. I mean, with their veto power. That's why we are demanding a democratization of the entire process. We want democracy even in the United Nations. So these structures need to be democratized. So that colonial mindset is there. A certain baggage of culture might be there, but again, it is real politics. I think because of my own disciplinary background in international relations, I would like to look at it that way. But
Yeah.
I would not say that this is the culture of the Western countries, because the people, definitely there is a difference between what the people are asking for, aspiring for, and what the government or the state is doing.
Hmm. Now, South Africa asserts that Israel is not only engaged in genocide, but it also is actively attempting to eradicate the Palestinian nation, specifically targeting the national, ethnic, and social components of the Gaza population. What is Human Rights Watch observation on this, Akshaya?
This is a subject that we continue as we continue to look at across all of the issues in Gaza and in Israel. So we have not made any conclusions on that issue, but what we have found, and I think this is really important, is that the Israeli authorities are committing the crime against humanity of apartheid, which includes systematically privileging one racial or ethnic group over another. And so in this case, Jewish Israelis are being privileged, not just in Green Line Israel, but also in Gaza and the West Bank over Arab Palestinians. And I think that that element of discrimination that's structural, that's systematic, that privileges one community over another, the fact that it has gone on now for so long with impunity, and in fact, some might say with a green light from some allied countries, really creates an enabling environment for atrocity, crimes. And that's why at Human Rights Watch, we are really committed and interested in continuing to document, research, and mobilize in the interest of preventing further atrocities. Because the other claim that South Africa has made is that the Israeli authorities have failed to prevent the crime of genocide. And I think that will bring us very important jurisprudence, because we will get the court's opinion on what exactly a state is meant to do to prevent the crime of genocide from taking place, and to what extent third states, for example, South Africa, they say they felt it was incumbent on them to bring this claim because they have a duty under the Genocide Convention. And so what other responsibilities do third states have? Is South Africa right? Are third states beholden to take action? And if so, what happens to the many third states who have actually done the opposite and been enablers? We've seen weapons transfers continue to the Israeli authorities, notwithstanding their use of these in ways that involve likely war crimes. And I think that enabling environment is one that we are really focused on at the moment.
That's actually a really good point, enabling environments, because I think this really so far has gone totally under the radar for a large extent, because there is all these other developments, and one tries to kind of go immediately to the straight line, like who's at fault and stuff. But then there's also the other component, like enabling, which is sort of a growing concept and growing word actually also that we all look at. Amina, what is your response to that or reaction to that?
Yes, exactly. I agree with her. If you continue to, on the one hand, if you say that you are not going to allow genocide, on the other hand, if you continue to supply arms, munitions, if you continue to trade with them, so you are creating an enabling environment, because that is directly helping the other state to carry on the acts of genocide. I mean, in the case of if I may bring in Myanmar again, I mean, this is one thing we had been continuously saying, that if the Western countries, not only the Western countries, even East Asian countries, Southeast Asian countries, if they continue their trades, relations, and if they continue to have absolutely normal relations with the state of Myanmar, so why would the state of Myanmar feel compelled to stop genocide? That is something one needs to take. The environment. When one talks about freedom, it's not only about one's own freedom. I mean, this is something which Nelson Mandela had said very clearly, that freedom just does not mean freedom for your own self, but you must also create an enabling environment for others to have that freedom.
Right.
I mean, you can't be free, you can't say that I'm free, and then unless your surroundings are also free, you can't claim yourself to be a democratic country, a country which fights for rights of others. I mean, you can't do that. So I do agree with her that we tend to focus on statements, we tend to focus on directly what particularly on the statements that are coming out, but we don't see or look across the trade relations, uh, the arms supplies, and what is also the kind of votes that are taking place in the United Nations, that that bolsters the country to go ahead and things that they are doing.
Yeah. Akshaya, are there actually any guideposts at this point that would sort of line out a little bit what marks an enabling environment? Are there like normal pillars or guideposts that have been already developed, where we say, okay, these are some pillars of an enabling environment, and this is what we can measure it against?
Well, we do have the law here, the law of individual criminal responsibility, I think will serve as an important guidepost because it includes the concept of complicity and of aiding and abetting liability. And this analysis is already happening in places inside the US government. For example, we know it's been documented that the US reflected on potential liability for State Department lawyers and officials who were approving continued arms sales to Saudi Arabia when they were indiscriminately bombing Yemen, is the specter of aiding and abetting liability because it exists in international law. The risk that a third party actor who is enabling or creating an enabling environment by equipping and aiding and abetting the perpetrator of abuses, they themselves can face liability through complicity. And I think that any public official, particularly those who are approving weapon sales in countries like the United Kingdom, like Canada, or even those who are continuing to approve ongoing joint training exercises, they should consider this risk of liability, complicity. And the international standards are clear on that issue and that matter.
Now let's talk about the process here for a moment. So what is next in the process? So the file has been claimed. Where are we in the process and what's next and what can be expected?
So we saw South Africa file its claim at the end of last year. And then in early to mid-January, we had these open and public hearings. The 11th of January, South Africa presented its case, and on the 12th, Israel gave its response in The Hague. The judges of the International Court of Justice heard those claims, and what they were talking about was not the merits of the actual claim. Is Israel committing the crime of genocide or not? Did Israel fail to prevent genocide or not? Rather, they were discussing the procedural matters in order to allow the court to move forward with the request for provisional measures, which is sort of the equivalent of an injunctive relief request that South Africa had asked. The idea behind provisional measures is to freeze the situation in place, to not allow either party to do anything that exacerbates the situation more. So in this case, the injunctive relief or the provisional measures are quite expansive in the request from South Africa. And I think in the next few days or maximum week or 2 weeks, we will hear the court's decision. A, do they think provisional measures are appropriate? And B, if they do, which provisional measures will they authorize? At that point, we'll be in a very interesting moment, because if the court does authorize provisional measures, they will also ask Israel to make public reports, likely, to explain how they are complying with those measures. And I think that's where, once again, we will come back to the question of enforcement on the international stage.
Because that would have been my next question. How do we actually enforce provisional measures in a country that's basically a sovereign country?
Well, you know that the ICJ is linked to the United Nations system, and the United Nations system does have the Security Council, which is structurally meant to serve as the enforcement arm. So if an order, whether it's a final decision order or an order for provisional measures of the International Court of Justice, is flouted, any state, particularly the state that brought the claim, has the right to go and seek enforcement through the Security Council. And so whether that be Myanmar flouting the provisional measures order, which was issued by the International Court of Justice, or any other state, that avenue or mechanism should exist. And I think that we will likely see an effort to use the Security Council as that enforcement arm. Whether that's successful or not will depend on if the US, which has the veto, allows it. I think we can predict what might happen. But what we know is that that veto, if they do choose to use it, will not be cost-free. Because here then you will have the US government, which in every other fora says it's committed to atrocity prevention, exercising its veto to shield the Israelis from an order which is ostensibly meant to prevent an atrocity.
Yeah, that's actually a very dicey. That's a very dicey case, actually, and I think also really time sort of to step up and see. So, do we have an international order or do we not? And then how do we balance it off? Is it time at this point to say, let's ditch all the past experiences and focus on humanitarian first? What's your response? I mean, what do you think about that?
Yes, I think so. We should look at the humanitarian first, because if you look at, the our past experiences with the United Nations, I mean, though we are very critical of United Nations, still it provides us with a platform where all countries can come together, and all countries have one vote. So at least some kind of some semblance of equality is there. But as I pointed out earlier, perhaps it is time to rethink about how to redesign and restructure this United Nations and what to do about the veto powers. That is something I think that needs to be seriously pondered about and pondered on, because we have seen cases like this. And then, like also on the question of the decisions are not binding. So, I mean, this is one of the major criticisms of ICJ, that the decisions are not binding. You can't force the states. As you asked, Akshay, the question that if what these are sovereign questions. I mean, these are sovereign countries. What do we do with them? And these are not only sovereign countries, but these countries are also backed by very strong powers. I mean, the major powers, superpowers. So it is a situation where countries like Bangladesh, uh, who are at the moment hosting victims of genocide, and which itself was born out of a genocide, we find ourselves to be in a very, in a situation where on the one hand we feel compelled to support cases like this. And I think, since we belong to the non-aligned group also, so we will continue to do that. And I may want to bring in culture over here also. I think culturally, also I think culturally people across the globe, they are against genocide, but somehow geopolitics and real politics has taken over the humanitarian aspect. But it is time to reinforce the humanitarian aspect and the ideals on which the United Nations was based on.
Yeah. So final question, Akshaya, that one is going to you. What do you see out of all the coming out of this for crisis advocacy going forward?
It's a great question. I think that the way the court handles this request for provisional measures, which is an urgent request, it's an appeal from South Africa to urgently ask the court to do something to stop the situation from getting worse. If that works, this will be an important tool for crisis advocacy in other situations around the world. For whatever it's worth, we've already seen, according to the New York Times, a drop in deaths in Gaza at the hand of Israeli aerial bombardment in the past few weeks, which coincides with the few weeks since South Africa has made this filing. And I think the Israeli authorities know that the eyes of the world are on them. We have seen them also take actions internally, domestically. The Attorney General committed to launch inquiries, investigations, and prosecutions into those who are inciting hatred, violence, and urging language that could be understood to be along for violence along ethnic lines. These are steps that have happened after this case has been filed. So for us who do work in crisis advocacy, I think this case and its outcome will have a great bearing on our ability to be successful in the future.
Thank you so much. And Amina, final word from you?
Well, I would like to echo the same, like feeling that um, uh, though I'm skeptical about it, but I do hope that something good would come out of it. And we should go back to the, like if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's not that we have any dearth of principles or laws, but it's just that, how can we empower people to come
So
forward?
could it be seen more as maybe an equalizer, so to speak?
But at a very high price, I must
A
say.
very high price, yeah. All right, thank you very much, ladies. Great for you to come on. Obviously, a very complicated issue and still lots to be resolved, which can be very momentous, as we just heard, going forward and really have great bearings on things. Or it could also be, on the other hand, quite a sobering moment. So we'll see. Thanks so much for coming on, and for our viewers, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.